2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. While global news networks were looping infrared footage of Tomahawk missiles illuminating the Tehran skyline, a far more devastating explosion was occurring on the screens of the U.S. Treasury. The 10-year yield plunged in a violent flight to safety, signaling a market that isn't celebrating a military victory, but mourning a structural collapse. The mainstream press is currently selling you a narrative of shock and awe 2.0, a story of surgical precision and tactical dominance. But for those of us observing the internal gears of Washington, the reality is far more somber. We are witnessing the terminal expiration of the peace dividend. For over 30 years, the American middle class has lived on the free fuel of global stability. Since 1991, we've been able to fund consumer growth and social welfare because we weren't burning $8 million a day just to keep a single carrier strike group operational in a high-intensity kinetic war. Tonight, that surplus evaporated. What we are seeing is strategic inertia. The United States hasn't just entered a new war, it has suffered an unintended mutation of the state itself. We have transitioned from a wealth-creating superpower into a fortress economy, an institution that must now burn its fiscal future just to protect a maritime dominance that the rest of the world is actively engineering a way to bypass. Don't be distracted by the fireworks. The tactical success you see on the news is a mask for a profound institutional failure. We aren't just launching missiles, we are launching the terminal remnants of our purchasing power. This is the quiet failure of the American century, and it's being billed directly to you. To understand the true cost of Operation Epic Fury, we have to look past the fire and brimstone. We need to look at the ledger. Let's talk about the math of a single Tomahawk land attack missile. One unit costs approximately $2 million. In the last 24 hours, the US has launched over 200 of them. That is $400 million vaporized in a single day of kinetic activity. But the missile is just the tip of the fiscal iceberg. The primary mechanism at play here is what we call strategic inertia fueled by incentive failure. In Washington, war is funded through emergency supplemental appropriations. This is a sophisticated legislative loophole that allows the government to bypass standard budget caps. It is essentially a blank check that skips the debate over whether we should be spending this money on crumbling American bridges or our failing healthcare system. Here is the insider secret. Under Section 122 of the Defense Fiscal Framework, military spending is categorized as final consumption. Unlike an investment in nuclear fusion or a high-speed rail network, which creates an economic multiplier, a $2 million missile has a return on investment of exactly 0%. It creates no value, it only destroys it. But where does the money actually come from? Since the US Treasury is already $36 trillion in the red, this war is funded by debt. To sell this debt, the Treasury must compete for capital, leading to the crowding out effect. This is why your 30-year fixed mortgage is stuck at 7.5%, even when the official inflation numbers claim things are cooling. The government is sucking all the oxygen out of the credit market to fund the war, leaving you with the crumbs. Worse still is the unintended mutation of our monetary base. As the Fed accommodates this debt, the M2 money supply expands, leading to what I call the permanent inflation tax. You aren't being taxed at the IRS office, you are being taxed at the grocery store. When you pay 30% more for eggs and milk, you are effectively paying the fuel bill for the F-35s over Tehran. This is the mathematics of a fortress economy. We are optimizing for global power at the direct expense of domestic prosperity. It is a systematic extraction of wealth from the American kitchen table to the military-industrial complex, and it is operating exactly as designed. In the world of geopolitics, geography is a master that does not accept apologies. While Washington views Operation Epic Fury as a demonstration of power, the rest of the world sees it through the lens of strategic exhaustion. To understand the global chessboard, we have to look at the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide choke point that carries 20% of the world's petroleum. Iran doesn't need to win a kinetic war, they only need to make the cost of transit unbearable. As we speak, war risk insurance premiums for vessels in the Gulf have spiked by 400%. This is the geography tax. When the US military occupies these waters, it isn't just protecting freedom of navigation, it is inadvertently accelerating geopolitical autarky. Nations like China, India, and even the Gulf states are realizing that relying on a US-led security architecture is becoming a liability, not an asset. This is where the incentive failure becomes global. By weaponizing the US dollar to isolate Tehran, Washington has forced the BRICS Plus bloc to accelerate the development of the M-Bridge and other alternative payment systems. This isn't a moral rebellion, it is a structural de-risking mechanism. If the US can flip a switch and disconnect an entire economy, then every nation with a sovereign interest has a biological imperative to find a backdoor. Even our closest allies in the EU are performing a silent pivot. Berlin and Paris are observing the fiscal fragility of the United States, noting that the $36 trillion debt makes the American security guarantee look increasingly like a hollow promise. They see a superpower that is winning the battle but losing the map. The result is a bifurcation of the global order. We are moving away from a unipolar world toward a fragmented reality of fortress blocks. In this new era, the US is no longer the indispensable guarantor of trade. It is becoming a regional power that must use coercion to maintain what used to be maintained by trust. The unintended mutation of the global financial system is now irreversible. As we burn billions in the Persian Gulf, we are effectively funding the construction of the very systems that will eventually replace the dollar. The chessboard is being redrawn, and for the first time in 80 years, the US is not the one holding the pen. While the tactical displays in the Situation Room focus on targets neutralized, the real casualties of Operation Epic Fury are being recorded at the checkout counters of every grocery store from Ohio to Arizona. We often hear about sacrifice for the national interest, but it is time we examine the incentive failure of who actually signs the check. The battlefield isn't just in the dunes of Iran, it is on your kitchen table, and the shared burden is anything but equal. Let's look at the mechanics of the American dream under siege. As you've likely noticed, mortgage rates have refused to budge despite the Fed's previous promises. Why? Because the US government is currently in a desperate competition for capital to fund this $8 million a day maritime operation. This is the crowding out effect in its purest, most toxic form. When Washington floods the market with new treasury bonds to pay for missiles, it sucks the oxygen out of the credit market. For the average American family, this translates to a 30-year fixed mortgage stuck at 7.5%, effectively pricing an entire generation out of homeownership. You aren't just paying for the war with your taxes, you are paying for it with the house you can no longer afford to buy. Then there is the permanent inflation tax. Washington loves to use the PCE index to tell you inflation is contained, but it conveniently ignores the imported inflation of a wartime supply chain. When shipping insurance premiums in the Persian Gulf jump 400%, that cost isn't absorbed by the oil majors. It is exported directly into the price of your milk, your eggs, and your heating bill. This is an unintended mutation of our economy. We have traded the peace dividend for a war premium. But perhaps the most cynical aspect of this burden is the quiet gutting of our social infrastructure. Under the guise of national emergency, we are seeing a reallocation of funds that should have been the bedrock of our future. Every $2 million Tomahawk launched is a choice not to repair a collapsing bridge in Pennsylvania, or not to reduce the wait times at a VA hospital. This is fiscal fragility by design. We are witnessing a systematic extraction of wealth from the American domestic base to maintain a global posture that is increasingly disconnected from the prosperity of the people it claims to protect. The fortress economy doesn't just defend the borders, it traps the citizens inside a cycle of debt and declining purchasing power. You are being told this war is for your security, but a look at your bank statement suggests it is the greatest threat to your stability. As we conclude this structural autopsy of the current conflict, we are left with a singular, sophisticated realization. Operation Epic Fury is not just a military campaign. It is the final act of a 30-year economic era. The peace dividend, the silent engine that fueled the American middle class since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has officially stalled. What we've dissected today is the unintended mutation of the American state. We have spent decades optimizing for global power, but in doing so, we have built a system characterized by strategic inertia. The institutions in Washington are no longer designed to produce prosperity. They are designed to maintain a global posture that the underlying economy can no longer afford. This is the fiscal fragility of a superpower. We have traded the stability of the American kitchen table for the projection of maritime dominance. And as we've seen through the mechanics of the permanent inflation tax and the crowding out effect, the bill for this trade-off is being extracted from your purchasing power, your home ownership, and your future security. The existential question for us, as informed observers, is no longer about whether we can win in the dunes of Iran or the waters of the Gulf. The question is this: is the United States still a nation with an army, or has it become an army with a nation attached to it? When a superpower begins to prioritize the fortress economy over the domestic social contract, it signals a transition from an era of leadership to an era of survival. The fireworks over Tehran are bright, but they cast a long, dark shadow over the American dream. You now see the gears, you understand the incentives, and you know that the shared burden is the price of a hegemony that is increasingly disconnected from the people it claims to protect. The century of American prosperity was built on peace. Its future will be determined by how we handle the cost of this permanent war. As an analyst who has tracked the rise and fall of geopolitical doctrines for decades, my forecast for the next 48 hours and beyond is not focused on the tactical survival of Tehran, but on the structural survival of Washington's financial hegemony. What we are witnessing is not a temporary crisis. It is the definitive birth of the fortress economy. First, let's examine the institutional collision. We are heading toward a constitutional confrontation over incentive failure. The executive branch is operating on a war footing that collides directly with the fiscal fragility of a $36 trillion debt structure. I anticipate one of two scenarios: either a historic intervention by the Supreme Court or a bipartisan revolt within the House Budget Committee. The legal battle will not be framed as a debate over the morality of war. It will center on the mechanics of guns versus butter. Does the president possess statutory authority to reallocate Social Security and Medicare baselines to fund overseas kinetic operations? This institutional gridlock alone could trigger severe volatility in the US dollar. Now zoom out to the global chessboard. The shift toward geopolitical autarky is no longer theoretical, it is accelerating. Expect a formal announcement from the BRICS Plus bloc, possibly an energy for gold settlement framework. This is the unintended mutation of sanctions strategy. By weaponizing the SWIFT system, we forced adversaries to build alternatives. The scaffolding for a post-dollar settlement architecture is already under construction. Washington's strategic plan is shifting accordingly. It is no longer about maintaining a frictionless global marketplace. It is about securitizing the remaining sphere of influence. So what does this mean for the sophisticated insider? The baseline assumption must change. The permanent inflation tax is no longer cyclical, it is structural. Institutional capital is already rotating away from paper promises, long-duration bonds and speculative growth equities toward hard assets, land, energy, defense logistics. In a fortress economy, tangible leverage replaces financial abstraction. My final assessment: the United States may win the tactical engagement in the Persian Gulf, but it is losing the strategic race for fiscal sustainability. The peace dividend is finished. The era of strategic sacrifice has begun. The path forward is binary: managed decline or radical restructuring. As the president prepares his address tonight, look past the rhetoric of victory. Watch the yield curve, watch the credit spreads, watch the ratings outlook of systemically important banks. That is where the real history of the next decade is being written. History is not written by those who watch the headlines. It is written by those who understand the rules of the game. Subscribe to our deep dive series as we continue tracking the unintended mutations of the global order.